All right, it's setting up the live stream, so just one more minute. Great. And I will also start recording this. There we go. Now we can get started. Thanks everyone for your patience this evening, and for being here tonight on a sunny March evening, though the wind is blowing here in Talkeetna. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Margaret Stern, and I'm the Program and Communications Director for the Susitna River Coalition. And SRC is a small watershed-based nonprofit working across the Susitna drainage and focused on the long-term health of the rivers and waterways and the community that depends on all of the Susitna drainage. This event is part of our winter speaker series, and we host this every year to bring folks together around issues that shape the watershed. We sometimes talk about policy, sometimes science, or sometimes folks' adventure across the Susitna watershed. And we're really excited today to have Cody Jacobson here to be our March speaker to talk about something that is definitely a growing issue within the Susitna drainage, and that is the state of Elodea. So before we get started, I also want to thank the Jessica Stevens Community Foundation for helping support this series. We appreciate their backing and making these monthly conversations happening, or these monthly conversations possible. A quick note on logistics. If you have questions as you go, feel free to put them into the chat and we will get them answered for you. And we'll keep an eye on those and make sure that we get to as many as we can after the presentation. Like I said earlier, tonight's conversation is focused on Elodea, something that might not look like much at first, but again is a growing issue across the Susitna watershed. So the goal tonight is pretty simple, and that's to get a clear understanding of what is happening with Elodea within the Susitna drainage, where it's showing up, and what to be paying attention to as we head into this year's recreation season. So I'm really excited to have Cody Jacobson here today. He's from the Department of Natural Resources, Division of Agriculture, and I've watched him give a few talks at the Mat-Su Salmon Habitat Partnership Salmon Science Symposium over the years. He's a really good presenter and really paints a great picture of invasive species in the area. So I'm really excited to have him here to chat with us about his work and what he's seeing on the ground in the watershed and what he's seeing with Elodea in particular. So I will pass the screen share over to you, Cody, and thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Now the technical part.
Yes.
Oh, let's see.
Always a Zoom problem. So again, just as we're waiting for the screen to share, feel free to answer or ask any questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get Cody to answer them at the end of this session. And we're excited to have him here.
Okay, I think I've got it there, Margaret. Yep, you got the first slide?
Yeah, you got it.
Looks good. Well, thank you, everyone. As Margaret mentioned, my name is Cody Jacobson. I work for the Division of Agriculture, housed within Department of Natural Resources within the state of Alaska. And one of our major things that we are focusing on the Division of Agriculture is Elodea and Elodea treatments throughout the entire state. I am the invasive species coordinator for DNR, dealing with plants and both aquatic, which is what Elodea is, and terrestrial. But tonight we'll be focusing mainly on the Susitna drainage and on Elodea and its impacts to salmon habitat, recreation throughout Alaska, but of course a focus on the Susitna drainage. So, and you can see from my first slide, we're kind of covering the whole area here, but we'll jump right in. So first we need to learn what Elodea is. If you're unfamiliar with it, Elodea is the first aquatic invasive plant known to be present in Alaska. It is currently the only one known to be in Alaska. It's a submerged plant. And Elodea canadensis is a scientific name, common name Canada waterweed. It's actually native to a large portion of the lower 48. We'll have a map here in a second kind of demonstrating that. But native to North America in many parts, although it's interesting, even in its native range, it can pose some invasive tendencies. And we'll get into what invasive means. But where it is non-native in Alaska and deemed invasive, which has the properties of causing economic or ecological harm to the environment, we see it really grow quite rapidly and expansively where it's been introduced. These negative ecological impacts can include native fish habitat, of in particular concern, of course, in the Susitna drainage as we work through, salmon stocks being in a tough way and having a hard time. Their habitat is critical to their recovery. And that's why we are so interested in trying to keep Elodea out of that region, as well as work on the areas it has found its way into. It is native, like I said, to the lower 48 in a lot of places, but there's a pretty large gap between us and it's kind of the last southern reach of Canada. Interestingly, it is not native to Europe and is having very similar effects across Northern Europe, Scandinavia, where it has also been introduced. It seems to run on that kind of northern parallel between 35 and 55 degrees north latitude. And that's where it's having most of its effects. Likely introduced to Alaska originally through an aquarium plant dumping. Our earliest known accounts of it are in the Cordova region in Eyak Lake in the early 80s. And there was quite a bit of surveying in that watershed prior to that, and it never was present. Of course, science is a lot more advanced now than it was in the 70s and the 80s as far as survey data and whatnot. But it's when we see it introduced and popping up in the South Central region and in Fairbanks on the Kenai Peninsula, oftentimes it's from either an aquarium dump and then transported via other human nature, whether that be watercraft or floatplanes and so on. And so the really hard thing about Elodea is that only a very small portion, a fragment of it, which I'll talk more about in a little bit, is needed to create a whole new population. That's why it's so popular in the aquarium trade, is because it's very easy to grow. This is that native range map by the USGS. You can kind of see in shaded yellow there is where it's very happy. Very common throughout the Midwest states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and even we see it on the east and west coast as well. At some point, it reaches a threshold where it's simply too warm for it. It does like its cooler temperatures for sure. But again, and even some of these where it's native, it can still cause some invasive tendencies. Hopping over to a world view, because I think it's kind of good to keep this in mind. This is the distribution. This is a heat map. So, of course, the darker red squares are where it's extremely dense throughout. And you can see how it's moved across Western Europe pretty extensively. But yet not very common in the Southern Hemisphere, although there are parts of, I guess you'd call it, cooler Australia that they're dealing with it as well. To date, Antarctica is about the only spot it hasn't been introduced as far as continent wide. So that's also very interesting, but I doubt that's going to happen, hopefully anytime soon. But you see just a little bit of distribution up in Alaska. And I think this is an important picture to paint because we'll get a little heavier into the talk, that it isn't everywhere yet. And we don't want it to be everywhere. And this action that we can take today could really be a lot of, what it looks like in the future. We don't want our future to look like what Western Europe started out in the 1800s. So there's still time to act. This is a mapper that was put together by a number of folks. It's an ArcGIS. A little heavy on the maps here. I apologize, but I think it's good to paint this picture. And, You can literally just Google, type into your phone, Alaska Elodea mapper or Alaska survey map, and this will be the first thing in your search engine. So it's very easy to find. Probably best viewed on the desktop. It's a little easier to see. And I'm going to zoom in here in a second, but basically what we all know is Alaska is a huge state. In fact, technically not all of it's in that screen, right? Because we have the Aleutian chain and whatnot, and parts of Southeast down there. But the yellow blocks represent where we have surveyed, where we have looked. And then you can kind of see these purple spots, which I'll zoom in here in a second. That's where we have known occurrences throughout the state. So right now it is still fairly hemmed in to a portion of interior, kind of surrounding the Fairbanks area. Cordova, which is obviously off to the east of the Prince William Sound there. And then let's call it South Central. So Kenai Peninsula, Anchorage, and the Matsu Valley. If we move in a little further, we kind of see the distribution a little better. And this is more focused on South Central now, with including that Cordova. I think it's important to understand kind of the temporal movement of this plant. Again, I mentioned that prior to basically 2010, our only known locations of it were, of course, now off the map almost, is in Eak Lake in Cordova in 1982 and Chena Slough near Fairbanks in 2010. Well, the infestation in Fairbanks, I think, really caused people to notice quite a bit. Anyone familiar with Chena Slough knows it's a meandering, not very deep, shallow, warm water system that basically runs through Fairbanks. And so it's very present of sight and mind for people to see. And that population got very dense very quickly. The stuff over in Cordova, I think it was just a little bit more out of sight, out of mind. It hadn't really caused a lot of impacts. And we see this very often on the invasion curve, where an invasive species is first introduced or makes landing, so to say, and it just kind of sits there and simmers a little bit. And then all of a sudden, there's just these huge, rapid expansion points, whether they be through human interactions, through our how we move around this landscape, as well as natural habitat, or natural occurrences, maybe a high water year, or a lot of snow melt or something like that causes these aquatic species to move around. After that, in 2010, in reality, we probably just started looking for it a lot more. And you pretty quickly see a lot of rapid, and I'll switch to that screen. So now I've cleaned this up a little bit and I've dropped out those bright yellow dots. And now we're focusing on the infestations, which some of these have actually been cleaned, which is fantastic. They have been eradicated. In fact, on the Kenai Peninsula, which I won't touch a whole lot on this evening, but there is only one known infestation still known on the whole Kenai Peninsula. And as if I back up, you can see there's a ton of surveys that occurred throughout that region. So largely due to the refuge and so on. But if I come forward to this map again, in 2014, Anchorage kind of gets hit to where we see it in a number of Anchorage lakes: DeLong, Sand Lake, Little Campbell, and in Lake Hood. And I think this is where people really started to take notice, really concerned. If you want to say the alarm was sounded, perhaps, because as most folks know, Lake Hood is the largest floatplane, seaplane base in Alaska, and perhaps, I believe, maybe even the world. That a lot of traffic leaves that, and we'll have another map I'll show later in the presentation that really points that point home. I think brings it home for folks that, and again, as I mentioned, it literally takes just a 2-inch fragment of this plant to be carried away to create a whole new population. So it's very important to kind of keep that in mind. Also, during this period, the Kenai Peninsula area, again, I think folks are really looking at, a lot of agencies are now involved, Fish and Wildlife, Fish and Game, DNR, and we start to see basically, we see these lakes starting to be discovered with Elodea. Whether or not, very likely was from a source coming out of Lake Hood, it's very possible. Some of them preceded Lake Hood, so it could be one seeded another, and so on and so forth. But floatplanes are certainly a heavy vector on a lot of this movement of this plant. 2012, 2013, 17, and then 19, you can kind of see that on the northern end of the peninsula. And then in 2023, I'll just mention this: Crescent Lake was found, which is the current known last infestation on the Kenai Peninsula. But if we kind of look at the Matsu, we zoom in on sort of say of the Susitna drainage, we see there's Alexander Lake and the Sucker Lakes, which is a set of three lakes out in basically western Susitna off the Yetna drainage, off Alexander Creek there, or excuse me, just south of the Yetna drainage that comes into the Susitna. Alexander Lake, which we'll see in great detail here later in the talk, but it's just perfect Elodea habitat. Shallow, soft bottom, warms up very quickly, which also makes it beautiful habitat to rear juvenile salmon at one point in time. So it's very important. It's also a very popular pike fishery, and it's a very popular floatplane lake to get into. But then we see after that, we see some locations there on Big Lake. That's probably our largest infestation at this point in the Matsu. And that was discovered in 2019. And then later Flat and Mere, sometimes called Mud Lake, in basically 2023. So what does this plant look like? You know, if nothing else, we come away from this talk, I hope you can recognize this plant out in the wild and be the citizen reporter that helps us find it early. And that's a great thing about invasive species, is if you find them early, there are tools in our toolkit that we can do to really mitigate their damage and perhaps even eradicate them out of a watershed. So on the left is kind of a higher detail plant, as we heard earlier about it. It's a fully submerged aquatic plant. We'll see in a couple of photos where sometimes it will break surface, and that's because the vegetation is just so dense. The growth is so a very warm summer year we got. But typically it's always submerged. And really the giveaway to me is the lobes, or the leaflets, in a whirl of three, as we always hear it. So basically, if you hold the plant by a stalk, and in fact, I have kind of one in acrylic here, probably hard to see, but that's kind of the size we're looking at. And it all is based on its growth pattern and how much sunlight and what it's seen in the environment it has invaded. I've seen it very, very short, just emerging out of the mud, 6 inches, something like that, to where in some lakes, if it's very happy, you'll see dense patches of it that can easily go from bottom to surface 6, 8, 10 feet of water. It will inhabit deeper water. Margaret was actually asking about that before we got on. It will inhabit water easily. I've seen it in 15 to 20 feet of depth in, say, Big Lake, but it doesn't break surface there. So it's going to be, it'll top out at probably that 5-6 foot range. Sometimes the literature shows maybe as high as 3 meters, which would be 9 feet. But you see it, to me, when a large, dense patch of it almost looks snake-like, is what I tend to equate it to. Here's kind of the difference side by side of a bright sunny day, which is a great day to survey for it, on the left. And then our classic, sometimes summer of July, where it's a gray day, but it still really stands out. We have native vegetation, obviously, with lilies in the lower, and then lily pads and some mare's tail and horsetail up in the upper right of the screen, both all emergent plants. They will leave the water surface. But there's Elodea just filling in that zone completely. And that area could be something where maybe it's space that's taken up by another native submerged plant, or in reality, that might be a travel corridor for flow for a creek, or transit for salmon. They're trying to migrate up into their headwaters. And this plant is completely blocking that flow. Some more uptail details. So that's, on the left there, that's me holding the plant, obviously. And it's just, that is a mass of Elodea. And that was just me reaching over the side and, during a treatment and grabbing it for the photos. On the right is, again, a very dense patch. This in some very tannic water. So you kind of see where it's very adaptive. as in most traits of an invasive species, they can be very adaptive to the environment that they invade. So it's happy in bright clear water. It's happy in tannic water, which is very common in our interior areas, even in the Matsu. The other thing I really want to point out too is kind of the variation in growth. You can see where those leaf nodes, as we call them, get more spaced out as the plant gets taller, whereas the growth point is those leaves are very dense to each other. They're close and clustered. And it's an extremely aggressive weed. It spreads mainly by the vegetative breaking, like I mentioned, and that's just a natural trait of it. That's kind of how it works in its native range as well. It's able to overwinter. There's basically the root systems. If the plant fully dies back, there's root systems that are almost like buds in the mud that are also fragment. So even wintertime activities could be a possible vectoring. We've had reports of ice fishermen going out to certain water bodies and drilling down into ice, and they pull up strands of green Elodea on their ice augers. New roots are easily developed from these nodes by a simple fragment. These fragments will break in our natural breakup period that's getting ready to happen here, where if it's frozen into the ice over the winter, that ice will melt, it'll break up, chunks will go down river, and they could possibly re-root. And we'll see even a better photo of that here in a second. I love this photo because this comes out of Fairbanks. This is the pure density that this plant can achieve. I mean, that paddle is sitting there. It won't sink. This is when it's reached a threshold. You can actually see we're getting some algae growth. Very likely that water has terrible DO, dissolved oxygen, which we all kind of know fish need to survive. This is a wasteland. This is basically, and the other thing to keep in mind, especially for my plant folks, is all the nutrients that were in that bottom, that substrate that's there for other things to occur, other things to feed upon, other native plants to feed upon, have been drawn up by this Elodea. So it's depleting on multiple sources. They've seen as far as 30 to 60% reduction in sediment nutrients in some of these areas. They've seen where it actually can raise the pH as high as 8.5 through all the photosynthesis that's occurring. And in some places where they've tested it in some of the Scandinavian countries where it's densities like this, it's as high as 10 on the pH. So obviously very high numbers. We're moving out of places where fish are no longer going to inhabit this whatsoever. It's not a place they want to be. These kind of dense patches in the literature show that they really like to inhabit iron-rich areas, and I'm sure most of us in the Matsu know that we have plenty of iron in our water and in our soils. So it's not hard stretch to understand that why this plant is so happy in our area. And simply, and they really notice this in the Fairbanks Chena areas, this plant will top out, and there is simply no light penetrating down to any kind of depth. So even if there is some native plant down there that's hanging on, it's not going to receive any photosynthesis from this dense patch of Elodea blocking out all the sun. Not dissimilar to how we see with like a bird cherry tree or a chokecherry tree fully engulfing in an area, and the litter below is completely devoid of growth again. So it just forms a giant monoculture of dense growth. And then it's going to die off to a degree. And again, you're going to have this huge crash in your DOs as all that vegetation is now rotting. And so very inhabitable for your juvenile fish, your juvenile salmon. This photo here is just, again, kind of getting more out of recreational side of things. This one's out of Harding Lake, but Harding Lake is the big lake of Fairbanks. And this common is also, or this photo will be, unfortunately, I think, more common on Big Lake. And in other lakes as it starts to encroach on I'm sure this gentleman on his jet ski probably had no interest in launching into that to then draw all this vegetation. Because that's stick a paddle thick. You are not going to drive through that. So it's pretty amazing how dense this stuff can grow. Another one, I figured folks love the photos. And again, I hope you can identify this by the end. We're the presentation. Native vegetation on the left, of course, and you can see the Elodea is just basically working its way. Again, through root fragments and propagation, it's just going to completely engulf that whole basically weed bed there to where it's one dense. And all of your aquatic species, your to some degree, yeah, you'll see birds working around it, your ducks and stuff like that. But even at some point, to get to where they don't even want to deal with moving around within it. I've seen moose on Alexander struggle to kind of walk their way, swim their way through it. It's that kind of density levels you can reach in some of these habitats. Again, this is from a really good friend of ours out there on the Sucker Lake system. He sent this in. That is basically 75 acres of Elodea, dense from bottom to surface. You will not move a canoe through that. That is basically a recreational nightmare. The really wonderful thing I will say is that lake looks nothing like that today. The battle isn't over. We are still 100% working in that drainage. But at that point in time, I mean, that is something where you could, and we have had that, some of my prior folks that worked on this have had floatplanes literally get stuck trying to taxi up to the dock to offload supplies and whatnot, because this is just simply that dense. So that one there's from Walt. Little fun with some AI, as they say, kind of trying to bring this home. But how does Elodea spread? Well, it's quite simply it's fragmentation. That fragmentation can then move those fragments down through current, attachment to our equipment, and then of course you mentioned aquarium dumping. And I should have put it in here, but I will certainly mention, as far as the aquarium dumping goes, Division of Agriculture has the authority to quarantine species. And one of the things probably over 10 years ago at this point now, under the division, is they quarantined Elodea, basically Elodea species, because Elodea can actually hybrid, especially in the aquarium trade. So you got Elodea cancedensis, a Nutellii, they can interbreed them. So legally, Elodea can no longer be imported to the state. It cannot be sold in the state. It cannot be moved around in the state, period. And luckily, we also included some other species in there that aren't currently known here, but for folks that are from kind of lower 48, like Eurasian milfoil, a terrible aquatic weed. And anyone that's kind of from that, again, that upper Midwest or even the East Coast side, they know how bad. And honestly, now it's even on the West Coast. So at least that vector has been, we still get folks that ask, and we keep that quarantine intact for obvious reasons. So, but it's just such a hardy plant. It's just amazing how one little fragment can pass through. And here's some of those fragments. So the pinking, which I'll get to in just a second, that's actually caused by our treatments, but I wanted to show how this plant grows. Basically the main green stalk on my hand on the left photo there, that pink stalk is all brand new growth of that season. That growth is weeks old. The white line that's coming off to the left, that's a root fragment. That is that piece of fragment has been broken off, and that root is looking for a new home. And we see it again on the right-hand side, the clear portions. So again, smaller than the palm of my hand is all you need to regrow this plant. Again, kind of some fun, photo on the left is real, photo on the right is AI, which just blows my mind that such things work. But I think it's the point of getting it home. Is that, so photo on the left, this is literally out of Big Lake last fall, when some other supportive staff were out doing a survey for us, which was phenomenal. But you can see the piece of Elodea on that left propeller lobe. The stuff in brown is actually native. That's Siberian milfoil, a native milfoil species that we have in Alaska. But it's just that simple. You're just pulling out your boat, and there it is hanging, and you're getting ready to go to your next lake. So it is something that's very easily trial, and it's not just on the propeller; it's on the bunks, it's on the tires, it's the whole thing. When you move a boat, and this is just good practice. Honestly, this is good practice for anyone. When you leave a watershed, you should pull your plug on your boat. You should drain your boat. and make sure there's no standing water. And you should go around, do a walk around while you're putting your safety straps on, and pull off any vegetation and deposit it in either trash or upland, as they call it. Basically, don't put it back in the lake. And that's just good practice. And any mud, any substrate like that, because of course we're also trying to prevent invasive zebra mussels, quagga mussels, dry-scented mussels is the name of them, and other species, stuff we may not even know that's on the radar, but we want to just have good, clean practices. On that same note, again, I think it's just amazing. So this is a generated photo, but you kind of tell it doesn't quite get it quite right. But that's the future we could be looking at, and I hope it isn't. I hope it is not the future we're looking at, but to where everyone's ever ridden in a float plane, they know that those floats, they don't fully submerge, but it's certainly at takeoff, they draw water over those struts, and of course the water rudders. And I talk with all the time the Seaplane Association, the Civil Air Patrol, on how there's a wonderful video by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on literally you can look at seaplane in Alaska, but basically they talk about how to clean your planes, clean your floats, empty your floats, and then if you're taking off from a water body, and I would just say this is good practice in period, but if you're taking off from a water body that is infested, because we now know how to look up the Elodea survey mapper and look for those red dots, is that once you're safely off, of course, once you're over dry ground, go ahead and pump those water rudders, lift them up and down a few times to shake any vegetation that may have hooked onto your water rudders. And this plant, this is obviously from an ecological standpoint, we're obviously very concerned, but we should not dismiss the economical standpoint that threatens the Susitna drainage. I mean, we have thousands of flights that occur throughout a summer season of folks that just need to get to their cabin, or folks that are going for a fishing trip, or folks that are looking to do some flight seeing as tourists. And this plant could easily start moving to where water bodies are just not landable anymore, or if they are landable, it's not fun for the pilots. The participants aren't having a good time. Maybe you can't get up to your remote cabin because your Elodea is so dense in front of your cabin, it's just an absolute pain. And we see that in reality on some of the landowners that own land out on Alexander Lake in past. It's much better now because we've been treating, but there's documentation where this plant, even in native range, can reduce flows by up to 80%. So that reduced flow is causing sedimentation. So your water quality is going down. You could easily, and it's like in this slide right here, we got a couple of sockeyes. One on the left is in Big Lake, one on the right is in Alexander. And so what has that Elodea just done? It has taken over possible salmon spawning habitat. At bare minimum, it's creating less than ideal conditions because it's causing the waters to warm. It's changing the pH, we've already learned, and it's quite possibly reducing the dissolved oxygen due to die-off or other things that's changing throughout that type of large biomass of plant that can be dying off. And you're slowing the speed. Most of us all know, of course, in the Susitna drainage, we've got that wonderful cold, fast water, that water refugia in these streams and lakes and stuff where these juvenile salmon are rearing, that's kind of their lifeblood. And this plant is easily a way to dam that up, for lack of a better terminology. I mentioned the floatplanes and kind of the concern we should have or why we should focus on them. This is a map generated by UAF, Dr. Schwer, but it just kind of highlights where we know those Elodea infestations are, but then how far those floatplanes go. And to me, it's a very sobering map that these planes go everywhere. And in some ways, it's almost a bit shocking we don't have more, knock on wood, we don't have more infestations out there, considering how far flung these flights can go. One thing I will say that's very good is that Elodea cannot, that we know of yet, it's a tenacious plant, but it doesn't survive in salt water. So all my folks that I know fly to Kodiak or even Bristol or stuff like that, I ask, hey, is it a big thing to take a stop if you're leaving South Central, take a stop and land in some salt water and taxi around for a bit and raise and lower those rudders. And most of them are perfectly fine with it. So that's one thing we can do to just, really mitigate the risk. So we kind of know the plant. We know, what the concerns are ecologically and economically, and hopefully we certainly can identify it. What are we doing? What is the Division of Agriculture doing? Well, we've got a number of large studies throughout the state of Alaska, like I mentioned, through partners with the soil and water conservation districts and other folks. But I'm going to kind of focus just on the Susitna drainage, and I mentioned Alexander Lake. Very quickly, Alexander Lake, again, we know that was one of the earlier infestations almost a decade ago now, and we've been treating it for the last number of years. It is a 700-acre lake plus, because obviously when it floods, it can be even bigger, but it's perfect Elodea habitat. Shallow, soft bottom, warms up quickly, has good water inputs, but not too fast a current. So last year we used the product, which I'll briefly touch on, but last year's treatment in 2025 cost, just in the herbicide, about $600,000. This year it's going to be about $625,000 for the systemic herbicide. I should say systemic versus contact. Systemic means we're trying to kill that whole plant. We're trying to keep the plant and kill the root system so the plant cannot keep rejuvenating back year after year. But I would say we're right now on year 2 coming in here in 2026. So we're probably looking at another treatment in 2027 and hope to get funding for that. We are currently funded for 2026. How do we treat it? Well, there's a number of ways, but I mentioned the systemic treatment. Sonar 1 is a trade name, but fluoridone is the active ingredient. Sonar 1 are these pellets, and basically they're kind of, if we remember back as we were kids, we had those little dinosaurs that puffed up in the bathtub. Well, this is kind of that idea, is that most of the product is actually clay. There's only about 5% of it that is herbicide. And as the different clays dissolve in the watershed, they basically release the herbicide. So it's kind of a slow release. Alexander last year, like I said, we put almost 16,000 pounds of this product in. So it's a labor intensive. Luckily this year, and I'll touch on that here in just a second, we're switching to liquid, and I think we're getting even more aggressive, and we're really fine tuning our applications. And I think we're going to hit this plant really hard this year. But the nice thing about the systemic, which is very different, and plants, I will tell you, are tenacious. I've done a lot of invasive treatments in my career. With the plants, you need to keep the product at a good, or the concentrations at a level between the 45 and 90 days, and it needs to be about 8 to 12 parts per billion. And of course, parts per billion is very, very small. It's kind of a drop of blood in a swimming pool, so it's a very low concentration with which we treat at, and we do that purposely to eliminate the Elodea because it's very susceptible to fluoridone, but to damage our native plants as little as possible. And especially a lot of the native plants, and certainly in early caught infestations, the native plants have a much longer, what would be considered a seed bank. They have a much more depth that they can recover from. Sucker Lakes, which is just kind of to the south and west of Alexander Lake. It's interesting. I kind of actually doubt that Alexander, which we did find first, populated Sucker Lakes. In reality, I think Sucker Lake was an independent population from Lake Hood. And I think anecdotally, Alexander was probably populated or propagated from Sand Lake out of Anchorage, just due to certain floatplane traffic and whatnot. But a smaller system, think back, that was that canoe paddle, remembered? That cabin there kind of in the foreground, that was the individual. That whole lake, I'm talking shore to shore, top to bottom, was Elodea at one point in time. Now it's hard actually to find it. But we're talking about 344 acres in total. Again, shallow, soft bottom, really good growing habitat. This year, we're looking at about 75,000 for West and about 132,000 for the other 2 lakes. Mainly that's due to flow. So in a higher flowing system, we have to keep the concentrations up a little higher and a little longer. So, but again, wonderfully, we were awarded a 2026 grant from the Alaska Sustainable Salmon Fund, which has been a huge provider for Elodea treatments in the state of Alaska and a huge help to getting these large treatments conducted. And this is how we do the liquid. So we've kind of really been pioneering our strategy. You can see that it's a spray system, not dissimilar to how a tractor is used in a farm field. We're the Division of Agriculture, so that's kind of where we're coming from. But through all my work I've done prior in different aquatic invasive work, I'm kind of adapting this, and it's really become efficient. I think we're really doing a great job of getting this product in. Minimal contact to the environment, minimal disturbance to the watershed. We're not stirring up the bottom. We're not cutting through the plants. We're doing everything. And in fact, Alexander will probably most likely be applicated via airboat. So again, nothing in the water other than obviously the boat hull moving through the water. And there's just some of the products we currently use. Percellacor is interesting. I'll put a little red dot or star by that one. We have that permitted. It's not in process. It is permitted at this point. We haven't used it in Alaska yet. It's been seeing fantastic results on the East Coast and in British Columbia for Eurasian milfoil. I'm excited to try it. It's a different active ingredient, so there is more. We'll just call it paperwork that comes along with that, but maybe that's the future of how it interacts, because that's one thing I'm sure folks know when they're working on plants is you don't want to keep treating the same plant with the same herbicide over and over and over again. Although that's not the goal here. The goal of eradication across the state, we don't want to be in a suppression position, but I don't know if this will. There we go. So there it is in real time. Hopefully it's playing for you. Nice. But yeah, you can see the product is just directly basically injected into the water, and there's kind of it's actually Lady C in our background there, and we just out and make a bunch of circles, all GPS coordinated, all made for. So what does that product do? Fluoridone active ingredient has been used through lower 48 for many, many years. It's been used in Alaska for now approaching well over 15, 16 years. And what it does simply is it basically prevents the plant from being able to photosynthesize. It's a little more technical than that, but that's the process of it. It basically is starving the plant. The plant cannot photosynthesize. It cannot put stores back into its roots. And we get this kind of bleaching, or I call it pinking. And you can see it in the photos very well there. But that's basically, we've disrupted that process, and the chlorophyll is literally getting destroyed, not by the product so much, but actually by the UV of the sun that's trying to feed the plant. So we're kind of basically removing its sunscreen, if that makes more sense. And it's the UV damage is coming from the sun itself. Again, more plants just in the real world. You can kind of see that tip top, the growth node. So that means that, like anything, the plant takes its most recent growth to the very tip, and it basically is unable to put any stores back into the root system. And the photo on the right, that is actually what that bottom now looks like. So we're going from complete density in that bay. So it's kind of a photo down, a clump of it I pulled up. That's 2024. Here's 2025. So unfortunately, obviously the Elodea had completely, moved any kind of native plant out of there, but now we have the ability for those native plants to reestablish, and they will. I'll kind of hurry a little bit, but Big Lake, Elodea, this is probably the hot button issue, of course, for us. Big Lake is a huge lake. It's big, almost 2,500 acres. Not all of that is Elodea habitat because, of course, anyone that's familiar with Big Lake, it is a lot deeper, some rocky shoreline and so forth. Update, we have not been able to secure systemic funding for Big Lake. And when I say Big Lake, I typically Flat and Muir are just lumped in. Unfortunately, it's going to be a large chunk of change. It's hard to tell exactly how much we're looking at because the surveys, There was a pretty good survey done last year. I'm still working through some of that data. It was late in the fall. But the one thing I will say about that is that was surveyed in October. Literally a week later, I was out there treating with the diquat, which is, again, it's a contact herbicide. It's a prevention thing for vector. What that is we knock the top of the plant off. It is not, it's not specific. It will also damage native plants, but it's a way to put Elodea kind of on the bottom, so to say, and really knock down that chance of vectoring. And my concern is, where is this guy going? That's where is that float plane headed? Hopefully he's lifting his flaps or his rudders. And obviously people know there's a lot of float planes that work in and around Big Lake. So we need surveys. This is that survey I mentioned in the upper right. Red dots are positive, and then the blue dots are actually from the prior year. So we got 24 and 25, and you can see the spread has certainly occurred. We've got north launch, south launch. I would just say basically at this point in Big Lake, operating around Big Lake, have heed. You want to be decontaminating your boats, your airplanes, your jet skis, anything that you operate through Big Lake. And if we can act quickly, that's how we can treat. But then again, just quickly, there is the vector control. So again, I'm running drop tubes to get down deeper into the watershed. And this is the diquat. Beautiful day. I was just out there driving around in October, just out there with myself. But yeah, it was really nice day. But it was a little shocking to see how much Elodea is present out there. That's the effect or the result, shall we say. That top of the plant is now dead. Nice thing about kind of doing it a little bit later in the fall is that portion of the plant is not going to regenerate. I have seen it in an early spring or early summer application where you could see some regeneration from those stalks, shall we say. But the root structure is still in the mud. It's still in the substrate. So next spring, next summer, that plant's going to come back up. Sometimes it comes up with more vigor. I've also seen some of the areas that I've treated a couple of years in a row on Big Lake where the landowners are just all excited to thank me. They said, I've killed it, I've cured it. And I was like, no, it isn't cured, unfortunately. But it is probably taking a pretty hard hit because it's like anything. If the plant cannot, photosynthesize, can't regenerate, it might run out of its food stocks. I'll go real fast on 6 Mile Lake, which is on Jay Bear. I bring that up mainly for the idea that it's in Anchorage or Anchorage area, but it's just a hop, skip, and a jump from the Susitna Valley, obviously. And I know for a fact there's planes that go from 6 Mile Lake over to Big Lake, out to Alexander, and so on and so forth. So, if I take away nothing from this talk is that we need to be very vigilant on our vector control as we recreate out in this watersheds. Again, just kind of what that looked like. 6 Mile has been wonderful. The applications are going well. The plants are responding well, i.e. they're dying well. I mean, kind of see that center picture, which just amazes me. The black stalk there is probably something that was killed back a year prior at least. And then there's that pink bright lobe that's trying to reset itself. So the key on this, for sure, on these treatments is consistency and never pulling your foot off the pedal. Keep it on the gas, smash it down. We need to treat these full lake systems. We need to treat them aggressively, and we need to be consistent with our treatments. We need to be committed. This is just kind of a little bit of a scary one, but this is what this is a modeling. We all hear about modeling back in 2016, so it is a little bit old now, 10 years old. But this is what Elodea could look like between 2040 and 2060. So we're obviously nowhere near that, but that's the habitat suitability, as they say. As we're warming, the more and more habitat is becoming available to this plant. It's a little hard from this image, I apologize, but you can see the green dots. If I run my cursor, I don't know if that shows up. But again, interior, south central, and the Cordova area. Again, in some ways, the ray of light or sunshine is that, it's not throughout the Yukon area. It's not throughout Western Alaska, but it certainly has the ability to be so. And then just kind of summarize it all, what is the state of Elodea? We have challenges for sure. Funding will always be a challenge. These are very costly treatments. The DNR is committed through our staff, but I have to seek out the cost of the herbicide. It is very high. In rough numbers, 6 Mile is $100,000. Alexander is over 600,000. Sucker Lake's 200,000. Big Lake could easily be 500 to $1 million, and that's every year that what a treatment needs to look like. As you get through the treatments, and as we learn more with the herbicides, especially with their what I'd call partial lake treatments, we can bring that number down because we'll have eliminated some of those Elodea locations. But the price is high. In relative terms, though, those prices are tiny compared to the economic loss that you could see if we just walk away, if we just let this weed spread out. And I definitely want to emphasize that it's not everywhere. We need to survey more, and that's what I talk about. Surveys need to be yearly in some of these areas. Decontamination, as I've mentioned, is huge. We need the public to be as much involved as everyone. Clean your boats, clean your rudders, clean your equipment. Again, small fragment can set a new population off. And we're going to have some choices ahead of us, as far as our leaderships go and our folks that make the rules in Juneau, so to say. Which infestations are we going to concentrate on? Do we want to get all of them? Do we want to go for everything? Well, then we need to have that kind of backing and funding and so forth. And we need our partners out there, citizen scientists. Those are the folks that are going to find this plant. It's going to be a plant that you're going to see out in front of your dock on Lake X that you've been going to since you're a little kid, and it just doesn't look right. And that's the information we need. Going forward, we're going to have some new infestations. That's a reality. We need to be prepared for those. We're going to have some areas that are going to persist. Some areas are not going to follow that perfect, 3-year prescription. Some are going to be many years, just because they're so dynamic. Loss of funding. We're kind of in an interesting funding situation in the world right now. New technologies coming on. I'm looking at, again, the direct injections. New herbicides are on the horizon, hopefully, but we need to really get after this we need to demonstrate that this risk is far, far lower or more considerable than the loss we're willing to put up with. And I'll kind of have a quote that was amazing to me that came out of Europe. And this is, again, in the 1900s. The fearsome day is close at hand when all fresh waters of Europe will be full of this weed, so that no ship shall sail, no man can bathe, no duck can dive, and no fish can swim. And to me, they were 100 years ahead of us. So maybe something for food for thought. And I don't know if this will play. It might. Oh, so this was that survey. This was by the Tyonek Tribal Conservation District, and you can see that boat is literally stuck within the Elodea. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Cody. Thanks for sharing that sobering but also hopeful picture.
It is hopeful. I don't want to always, yes. When you work in invasive species, you sometimes become the Debbie Downer, and I never want to be that, but there is hope for sure. That's why we fight every day.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we do have some questions coming out in the chat, and so I'm actually going to bring Laura Wright. If you are interested in asking your question, I'm going to let you come on and ask your questions.
Yeah, sure. Hi. I live on a lake up in Talkeetna, and if I were to see some Elodea, what should I do? Could I hand pull it and carefully remove it?
So I wouldn't recommend that, Laura. I would recommend going, with as least amount of disturbance as you could. Get a good photo of it. So basically, if you want to grab a strand of it or something, or reach in the water and get me a good photo of it. And I'm sure Margaret has, or I can provide my contact, however, in the chat. But send us a photo. Photo is a million words, right? The reason I don't recommend folks going in and, getting their lawn rakes out or trying to pull it out is you're going to fragment it. And it's about the same equivalent as taking a dandelion in full bloom, a little white puffball, and blowing it into the air.
All
Those
right.
fragments are just going to set new ruts. So,
Okay. Next question. Does DNR periodically check that Elodea is not coming into pet shops or into schools?
yes.
Okay.
Yes. So we have an inspection team, which it's very small. But yeah, I always, every time I go in and even buy my personal dog food or whatnot, I do a tour across the aquatic area. Every year we send out basically notice letters involving the quarantine for the whole list of species we do not allow into Alaska. And most, I will say, the big box stores were very quickly to say, yeah, we don't want to have anything to do with this. There is still some kind of niche little, I won't name a name per se, but I'm sure you can find it on the internet pretty quickly, where you can buy like a little Elodea friend. And it's just interesting. So, of course, we cannot, control the entire internet, but we can control anyone that commercially sells and or we're made notified of. So again, if you're aware of it, let us know.
Okay, one last question. It looks like that Elodea does not break the surface of the water like the reeds or other items. So it's really just under the water unless it's a mat at the top if it's really thick. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So they'll basically, categorize it as emergent or submerged. And Elodea is almost always submerged. If it's to break the surface, it's because it's grown up and
Mm-hmm.
it's actually kind of matted upon itself, and you'll just see like a little bit of rippling on the water. But unlike a horsetail or a cattail or a mare's tail, that plant is meant to grow up, fully break the surface, and emerge. Uh, this Elodea does not do that.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you,
Awesome.
Laura.
Thanks, Laura. Along those lines, I had another question about, so a lot of times we think about invasives coming in and kind of co-opting an ecological niche of another native plant. What would that native plant be in the Alaska scenario? Or
Yeah,
su
absolutely. So, oh, I'm sorry, I
oh, sorry,
interrupted.
or suite of plants. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a host of them. I will say that Elodea also likes to just go where other plants don't want to go. A really good example would be Crescent Lake on the Kenai Peninsula. There is mats of Elodea that are just growing up out of bare sand. Like it's just and I'm certain, and I'm not a hydrologist, that's not my area of expertise, but I'd be willing to bet that there's probably an upwelling there of cold, fresh water that, a fragment has drifted and say, this is perfect. I'll be right here. And this plant is super adaptable. I mean, in its, kind of more native range, you rarely ever see it in any kind of flowing water. I've seen it in 150 CFS for, 200 CFS, which gets sciencey, but basically it's a flow rate, where it's basically just laying over on the bottom and it's just almost snake-like walking back and forth, but it is still inhabiting that area. I guess I quit sharing, but Siberian milfoil is a one that'd be a native plant that this certainly. Chara is another one, or Shara, depending on, technically not it's a vascular or not a vascular plant, but those are just basically, and I mean, I've seen it compete with lily pads to where you'll see lily pads start to disappear from a bay because, and anyone that's ever seen a lily pad root come up, it's ginormous. I mean, that's a huge stack. There's information in literature that those lily pads can last 100 years in the mud. And I think they will reemerge, but it's a matter of these plants. Elodea gets going early in the spring, sometimes even through the winter, and it's the first to emerge. It's the first to take that open space and get that sunshine, get all that growth, and it just blocks everything out.
Interesting. Thanks. Well, I know that citizen science and citizen work has been pretty valuable for a lot of your work, and I see that Bob Pence from Alexander
Oh, yeah.
Creek is on here. And I would love, Bob, if you're willing, I can read your what you said, but if you have anything to add about your experiences um, over in Alexander area, I can let you come on and put you on the spot.
Hello.
Hey, Bob.
Hey, Bob.
Hey, Cody. I just saw Cody yesterday. He was bringing in supplies for this spring's Floridone application and fuel and everything else he needed for this job. But yeah, I just wanted to thank Cody and DNR for their perseverance and their dedication to Alexander Lake because I've been here from day one when they first found it. And I am here now, and it's really, for all the people listening, it's really an ecological disaster if you just leave it untreated. It stops fish from swimming. It stops ducks from diving. Like Cody said, the moose get tangled up in it, and they can't even swim across the lake. And I mean, just to really push hard to keep DNR to keep the funding rolling and try to get rid of this stuff. And it's bad and it's nasty. And if it just kept on spreading throughout Alaska, it would be hard on anadromous fishes and salmon runs and things. So thank you, Cody. Appreciate it.
You
Thanks
bet, Bob. Thank you.
Sorry. Thanks for letting me put you on the spot, Bob. I appreciate it.
That's okay.
So another question is from Becky Long. Are there any non-herbicide solutions?
Not really, unfortunately, because of the nature of the plant and how well it fragments. They, when you go through a process of getting permitting and whatnot, you always look at a number of options, obviously. One of them being, what they call the no action option, which I highly don't recommend, but it is an option. And it's kind of like the, do less harm, so to say. And that's why we really, if we have the funding, if I had the world and I had the funding, I would say we would go right to, if we found a new infestation, perhaps we would aquatic just to knock down the vector if we couldn't get in there that very year. But then it would be systemic. I would just do the Floridone, and I will say, welcome any questions. I didn't want to go herbicide deep on it, but I certainly could. Do a little research on that, and it is the lowest classification as far as the warning labels. It's in caution. It's not even a warning label. And at the rates we apply it, we're in the single to sometimes teen digits of parts per billion. When they first found it up in China, they did attempt to do some diver-assisted suction dredging. And, basically the divers go down and they have a dredge. Maybe people are familiar kind of with the concept like mining in a sense. And they just created a whole host of issues. One is it's very hard to see the plant itself when you start doing that type of activity. You're really stirring up bottom sediment. And the key is you need to get the whole root. So if you just take the tops off, just like mowing the grass, in some ways you really haven't done anything. You may have actually invigorated it, in fact. Whereas and of course, think of all the fragments that you will create by that process. I've seen this plant, and it's a very adaptable plant. I've seen it where I'll reach down the water and I can grab a full strand, and I've reached down the water and it literally just fragments apart in your hand. It's willing to go off and grow from those fragments, of course. So the least disturbing method, that's what you're looking at, is a no action, a mechanical of sorts action, and then a herbicide route. And that's certainly, although it is sometimes, herbicides certainly do have some reputation across them. I will say aquatic herbicides are extremely vetted. They are not released without extensive research directly on the species. In fact, fluoridone was tested on species we have in this state because, of course, they're using it in other parts of the world and other parts of the United States, on salmon, on different stuff, and there's basically no effect. It's to where, as far as human harm, there isn't any. You're not photosynthesizing. So unless you're going to start growing like a tree, and again, it's at the level that we would have to ingest such a thing, because the danger is always with anything. It's more at the applicator level, not at the recreator level. You would honestly, you couldn't drink that much water. And so it's very, again, I welcome anyone to look at it, but no, herbicide is by far, although it is expensive and it is, it certainly can, and that's why we use the process, and that's why I'm excited about the new processes, is that to really hone in on only trying to remove the Elodea. So.
Awesome. Thank you for that clarification of that usage. Does anybody else have any other questions for Cody this evening, or anything that Cody, do you have any other things that you'd like to address before we sign off tonight?
No, I'd just like to thank everyone for their time. Really appreciate folks, hopping on and listening to me ramble on a little bit about Elodea. I'm certainly very passionate about, trying to reestablish these very pristine ecological areas. We are so farther ahead than parts of lower 48. So I certainly don't want to paint a very negative picture. I will certainly hang on to the torch that I think this is a winnable battle for sure. There will certainly be naysayers to that. I understand that, but I think it's a matter that we have to become motivated and be our own self-stewards. When we recreate in these watersheds, be mindful of our actions, look at our impacts and what we may be moving around, clean our gear, clean our floats, clean our boats, pull our plugs, do all those good things, clean, drain, dry, as they say. But yeah, just keep a mindful and watchful eye out for that ecosystem, because it is very precious, and it's very important that motivate the people that make the decisions on the funding, as I say, and hopefully that helps. But
Awesome. Yeah, it's encouraging to see in some ways that we're catching it somewhat early here, and that is where there's a lot of hope, because an infestation, it seems like, could just grow exponentially if left totally unchecked, based on some of those floatplane maps and just the way that people move and recreate across Alaska. So I'm super glad that you are so passionate about it, and glad we've got you on the team against Elodea.
You betcha.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for being here tonight. And thanks, of course, to Cody. I have a few things that I'd like to share with you all before we sign off for the evening. First of all, MEA, or Matanuska Electric Association elections, are coming up here, with voting beginning April 2nd. And Susitna River Coalition has endorsed 2 candidates, and those are Connie Fredenberg and Daniel Jensen. So if you don't know, everybody that pays an electric bill to MEA is a co-op member and member owner, and so you have the ability to vote in any of those MEA elections, and the folks that get on the board make decisions about where your energy comes from. So that's really important to Susitna River Coalition, because we formed in response to the Susitna Watata Hydro Project, and folks in those positions at MEA have the capacity to kind of drive where our energy is coming from into the future. Another thing that SRC has been following, there is a comment period that closes on April 1st for a public lands giveaway near Honolulu Pass and Watana Creek, and I will drop that comment period into the chat. Also, Earth Day is coming up next month in Talkeetna. It will be on April 18th downtown, and we'll be sharing more information out about Earth Day in our newsletters. And also, Susitna River Coalition is kicking off a citizen science program within the Susitna Watershed this season. So we will be collecting information from folks that want to be involved. We'll be putting together packets for you for where you go out and recreate in the watershed. You can take a little bit of data on water quality for us, and we'll get that out to folks and help kind of refine where some potential research in the future will happen in the Susitna watershed. So that's what we have going on. Hope to see you at some of our upcoming events and see you on future Winter Speaker Series events. And this will be up on YouTube, and you can share with your friends if you think they need to get schooled up on where Elodea is and what it looks like. So thank you so much, Cody. Thanks everyone for being here, and have a great spring evening.
Thank you, Margaret. Appreciate it.